Hey there! Thanks for stopping by. Enjoy the content, hit subscribe, and make sure to turn on notifications to stay updated. James was sitting on the couch, a book open in his lap, but his thoughts had drifted miles away from the words on the page. In the kitchen, Sarah was busy with dinner prep, though she seemed a bit preoccupied. Out of nowhere, she glanced over at him, her tone casual. "Oh, by the way, honey, I forgot to mention. My friend Megan is going to be staying with us for a few days. She's coming in from out of town and didn't want to shell out for a hotel." James looked up, still feeling a bit dazed. "Megan? I don't think I've ever heard you talk about her before." Sarah's smile was warm, almost nostalgic. "Oh, we go way back. We met in college. I did mention her once or twice, but that was ages ago. Megan's from a small town and was always pretty focused on her studies. We were practically inseparable back then." James nodded slowly, trying to shake off a vague unease he couldn't quite name. He returned to his book, letting that odd feeling linger at the back of his mind. 2 days later, when Sarah went to pick Megan up at the station, James was alone at home, his mind buzzing with unspoken questions. Figuring it'd be nice to make a good impression on Sarah's old friend, he decided to prepare something special for dinner. When they finally arrived, James was taken aback. Megan was nothing like he'd imagined. She was tall, with a confident, warm smile, and had a magnetic presence that filled the room. As he watched them hug, laughing and reminiscing like old friends, he began to see why Sarah had spoken of her with such fondness. At dinner, the atmosphere was light and easy, almost like a family gathering. Megan shared funny stories from their college days, while Sarah filled in the details, making everyone laugh until their sides hurt. James joined in, feeling himself relax, but he couldn't shake an underlying tension. Something in the air, an unspoken layer to it all that he couldn't quite put his finger on. Then, in the middle of their laughter and storytelling, Sarah casually dropped a bombshell. "You know, honey, there's something I never got around to telling you. Megan and I actually dated back in college." James froze, his fork suspended mid-air, the smile suddenly gone from his face. "Dated? What do you mean?" Sarah shrugged like it was no big deal. "It was just a phase, really. We were experimenting, figuring things out, you know? It was way before I met you, of course, and by graduation we went our separate ways. I didn't think it was relevant enough to mention." James felt like the ground was shifting beneath him. He looked over at Megan, who had a half-guilty, half-amused smile on her face. It felt surreal, like a movie where the main character realizes that everything he thought he knew was only part of the story. Trying to keep his composure, he felt his mind racing with questions. Why had Sarah never told him? Were there more things he didn't know? And more bafflingly, why did this revelation hit him so hard? The dinner went on, but the relaxed mood was replaced with a subtle tension. James tried to follow along with the conversation, but his mind kept circling back to Sarah's confession, unable to shake it off. He didn't know what to do with this new information, or with the unsettling way he was starting to see his wife. That night, lying beside Sarah in bed, everything felt changed. An invisible distance hung between them, a silence he couldn't figure out how to break. Sleep didn't come easily, and when he finally drifted off, he dreamt of Sarah and Megan back in college, as though trying to piece together a past that wasn't his. Megan's arrival had stirred up something unexpected, and James couldn't shake the feeling that this visit would be more than just a simple reunion. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he sensed that nothing would be the same again. The next morning, James found himself awake earlier than usual. With Sarah and Megan still asleep upstairs, he headed to the kitchen, started the coffee maker, and gazed out the window, lost in thought. A gentle morning light seeped through the curtains, casting a quiet glow over the house, and in that silence, every thought seemed magnified. He wrestled with why Sarah's unexpected revelation had unsettled him so deeply. Was it just that she had kept something so significant to herself? Or maybe, on some level, he felt shut out from a part of her life he hadn't known existed. The feeling gnawed at him, as though there was more to the story than what she had revealed. When Sarah and Megan eventually came downstairs, the house filled with a liveliness he wasn't prepared for. James was surprised by how effortlessly they slipped into conversation, as if last night's revelation was a small detail. But for him, it had hit harder. It wasn't so easy to brush aside. At breakfast, he couldn't help but observe them closely. They chatted about their college days, laughing over shared memories, and James felt a tug of curiosity. He wanted to understand that past of hers, a time that now felt distant yet strangely vivid in the present. Megan brought up a party they had attended, prompting Sarah to laugh, covering her face with her hand. "Oh, don't even mention that night," Sarah said, laughing. "I could barely walk the next day." Megan laughed too, and James caught a glimmer in her eyes, something undefinable. It felt like there was a layer to their friendship that only they understood, an invisible bond that left him uneasy. "That night was one of our best," Megan added, smiling at Sarah in a way that seemed full of unspoken meaning. James felt his chest tighten. He wasn't the type to get jealous, but watching his wife share memories with someone who clearly still held some feelings for her was unsettling. His mind wandered, picturing what their relationship must have been like, the kind of connection they shared, and wondering just how much of that remained. The day dragged by, each hour seeming to stretch out. That afternoon, Sarah suggested they take a walk to the nearby park so Megan could see the neighborhood. James agreed, even though something about the situation felt off to him. He almost felt like he was intruding on a moment that didn't belong to him. As they strolled, Sarah and Megan chatted about future plans and places they'd like to visit. James walked beside them, trying to join in, but somehow his words felt out of place. He found himself instead focusing on their words, on the little gestures and subtleties that passed between them. At one point, Sarah brought up a beach trip she and Megan had taken, and James couldn't hold back his curiosity. "So, how was that trip?" he asked, trying to sound casual. Megan glanced at him with an easy smile. "Oh, it was incredible. We spent a whole week in a little rental by the shore. We'd get up early to watch the sunrise." Sarah loved sitting out on the porch, listening to the waves while sipping her coffee. Sarah nodded with a warm smile. Those were good times, but they were so long ago. James noticed a touch of wistfulness in her voice that stirred something uncomfortable in him. It wasn't jealousy over what they'd shared. It was the sense that there were sides of Sarah he'd never known. He felt like a stranger, trying to make sense of a story missing key parts. Back home, he watched as Sarah and Megan teamed up in the kitchen to prepare dinner. The way they moved together, the laughter between them, and how they seemed to communicate without words made him question whether their connection was really in the past, as Sarah claimed. Megan exuded confidence and charisma, and something about her stirred a complicated mix of attraction and discomfort in James. At one point, Megan came over to James, offering him a glass of wine. "It must feel strange for you, huh?" Megan asked softly, her gaze meeting his. "Me just showing up like this, bringing back all these old memories." James tried to mask his unease, but a nervous smile broke through. "A bit, yeah," he admitted. "Mostly, it just feels strange because I never knew this side of Sarah's life." Megan seemed to think about his words for a moment. "Maybe it's because she worked so hard to leave it behind. College was complicated for both of us, and I think she wanted to move forward." Her response only added to James's confusion. Why would Sarah have gone to such lengths to bury that part of her life? He wanted to ask more, to dig a little deeper, but something held him back. Maybe it was the worry of uncovering even more secrets that lay hidden beneath the surface. That night, as he lay down beside Sarah, James felt a discomforting distance between them, more so than he'd felt in years. Megan's presence seemed to have opened a door into a past he never knew existed, and now that it was open, he didn't know how to close it. The silence in their room felt stifling, and as Sarah drifted off to sleep, James stared at the ceiling, wondering if he really knew the woman he had married. The days rolled by, but James felt himself spiraling into an emotional whirlwind he couldn't control. Megan's presence in their home, with her confident demeanor and casual smile, stirred an odd restlessness in him. The fact that she had been such a big part of Sarah's life, a part he had never known, made each moment feel charged, like something new was awakening inside him with every glance, every word. One evening, After another dinner filled with laughter and reminiscing, James sat alone in the dimly lit living room, the glow of the lamp casting long shadows across the walls. From there, he could see Sarah and Megan chatting in the kitchen, their laughter drifting into the room. A pang of jealousy rose in him, mingled with a strange, consuming curiosity. He reached for his wine glass, and suddenly, an audacious thought popped into his mind, so startling that he had to sit back, almost to catch his breath. The idea of suggesting a ménage à trois whispered through his head like some forbidden temptation, making his pulse quicken. It was crazy, reckless even, but the intensity of the thought caught him off guard. For several minutes, James wrestled with the notion. He knew he could never actually bring it up to Sarah. She'd probably think he'd lost his mind, or worse, that he was undermining everything they'd built together. But still, a part of him wondered, would she really react that way? And what about Megan? She seemed so at ease, so open. These questions gnawed at him, a strange thrill pounding in his temples, filling him with a nervous energy. He got up, pacing around the house in an attempt to shake the thought from his mind, but it lingered, as if it had settled in with a life of its own. Eventually, he drifted back toward the kitchen, where the two women were still chatting happily. Standing in the doorway, he watched them. Megan noticed him first and grinned. "Hey, come over here. We're reminiscing about Sarah's first attempt at cooking. It was a total disaster," she said, laughing. Sarah turned around, laughing as well. "I almost burned the kitchen down," she added with a playful laugh. James smiled back, though his face felt hot. How could he entertain such an absurd thought while Sarah stood there, genuinely happy and relaxed? A wave of guilt washed over him, but the forbidden desire clung to him, whispering like a temptation he just couldn't shake. "Everything all right?" Sarah asked, noticing his expression. James nodded, doing his best to push away the turmoil swirling in his mind. "Yeah, just thinking." Megan raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Thinking about what?" He hesitated, feeling the weight of the unspoken thoughts. "About how you two have so many stories I've never heard. It's interesting to get a glimpse into these different sides of you." Sarah's face softened with a relieved smile. "Oh, just memories from back in the day. But I'm glad you're getting to see this part of me." Megan's gaze lingered on James for a moment longer, as though she sensed something hidden in his words. His heart sped up, feeling almost exposed under her stare. But then she smiled, a warm, genuine smile that somehow put him at ease, if only just a little. "You know, James, you're a lucky guy. Sarah's an incredible person. You two really make a beautiful couple," Megan said with such sincerity that it caught him off guard. He tried to smile back, but it felt strained. He wanted to agree, to say that yes, he was lucky, but all he could think about was the confusion inside him. What did these feelings even mean, and what did they say about his relationship with Sarah? That night, his thoughts raced, caught between emotions he couldn't untangle. Lying in bed next to Sarah, who was already drifting off, he looked at her, so peaceful and unaware of the conflict tearing through him. A lump formed in his throat. How could he even begin to talk about something so dangerous and unpredictable? Sleep was elusive. Staring up at the ceiling, he tried to shove the temptation from his mind, but it lingered, haunting him. Images of him, Sarah, and Megan together flickered through his imagination, only to be drowned out by waves of guilt that made him cringe in shame. Finally, in the middle of the night, he slipped out of bed and onto the porch, the chill of the night air offering a sharp, grounding calm. He needed to sort through his thoughts, to figure out what he really wanted and what it might mean for him and Sarah. Deep down, he feared that letting himself act on this impulse could unravel everything they had built together. As he stood there on the porch, surrounded by the quiet darkness and his swirling thoughts, he noticed movement in the kitchen. The door opened slowly, and Megan stepped inside, heading for the sink. His breath caught when he realized she was entirely naked, moving with a confidence that seemed almost dreamlike. The soft light in the kitchen illuminated her silhouette, casting each curve in a glow that felt both intimate and surreal. Megan turned on the faucet, filled a glass with water, and took slow sips, her eyes closed, unaware of James's presence just outside. He stayed motionless, his heart pounding as he tried to process this unexpected, forbidden moment. When he finally returned to the bedroom, he moved quietly, as if each step might shatter the silence of the night. The scene he had just witnessed replayed in his mind like a wild rhythm he couldn't escape. Lying down beside Sarah, who slept soundly, oblivious to his inner turmoil, he stared at the ceiling, unable to close his eyes. The memory of Megan, uninhibited and so natural in that quiet kitchen, danced through his mind. That vision, her figure softly lit by the glow of the kitchen, stirred something in him, fueling the desire that had once seemed so outrageous. Now it pulsed with a force that felt nearly unstoppable. He lay there, teetering on the edge between desire and guilt, caught in a storm he couldn't outrun, unable to find the peace of sleep. The night dragged on, and as the first hints of dawn crept in, James felt himself standing at the edge of a cliff. He knew he'd have to confront this desire before it consumed him entirely. The next morning, James made his way downstairs, his mind a chaotic tangle of emotions. Each step felt heavy, echoing his uncertainty, and he wondered how he'd get through the day after what he'd seen in the early hours. Entering the kitchen, he found Sarah and Megan at the table, laughing and chatting as if it were any other morning. Their light-hearted conversation was a stark contrast to the storm still churning in his mind. Megan sat with her back to the window, the morning light outlining her figure through the thin fabric of her dress. She moved with an effortless grace, yet her eyes held an intensity that James couldn't ignore. Meanwhile, Sarah seemed absorbed in making coffee, her mind on small, casual details about their plans for the day. "Good morning," Sarah greeted him with a smile, handing him a cup of coffee. James took it, letting the warmth of the cup steady him against the chill he felt inside. He sat down beside her while Megan, seated across from him, looked at him with a gaze that seemed to see straight through him. He forced a smile and tried to follow the conversation, but the memory of Megan, naked and serene in the kitchen, lingered like an insistent shadow. He avoided looking directly at her, but it was as if her presence filled every corner of the room, her soft laughter amplifying the tension inside him. His stomach tightened, a turbulent mix of desire and guilt threatening to overwhelm him. Just then, Sarah stood up to fetch more toast, and with perfect timing, Megan leaned subtly in his direction. That slight movement somehow made the air between them feel dense, harder to breathe. With a smile that held a hint of mischief, she whispered, "Did you like what you saw last night?" James froze. His heart seemed to stop and then thunder back to life, pounding wildly in his chest. His eyes locked onto hers, and for a brief moment, he felt himself teetering on the edge of something unknown. Her words echoed in his mind, unleashing a wave of heat that left him reeling. He opened his mouth to speak, but his throat felt parched, his words caught. Megan's smile didn't waver. Her eyes held his, challenging, dangerous, and for an instant time seemed to stand still. James realized he was caught in a game he didn't understand, one where each move could lead to a disaster. The tension between them grew heavier, as if they both sensed that an invisible boundary had been crossed. Before James could respond, Sarah returned to the table with a plate of toast, still cheerfully discussing their plans for the day, completely oblivious to the charged atmosphere around her. James forced himself to tear his gaze from Megan, trying to focus on Sarah's words, but Megan's whispered provocation replayed in his mind, more vivid and consuming than anything else that morning. "Everything okay, honey?" Sarah asked, noticing his distant expression. Yeah, he managed, his voice coming out louder than he'd intended. He swallowed hard, struggling to block out the image of Megan in the kitchen and that knowing sparkle in her eyes. "Just thinking about something else." Sarah smiled, unfazed, and resumed talking about the park they'd planned to visit. James nodded along, his mind caught in that forbidden moment where, with just a single sentence, Megan had kindled a fire he was barely managing to contain. Megan, meanwhile, leaned back in her chair, completely at ease. She raised her coffee cup to her lips, but before taking a sip, she cast one last look at James. A light, enigmatic smile that seemed to challenge him to keep going down the path she'd started. He felt trapped, as though she'd woven an invisible web around him where every move he made was carefully scrutinized. While Sarah chatted away, Megan's gaze remained locked on his, like a magnet pulling him in. In that moment, James knew that this weekend was about to become far more complicated than he had ever anticipated. That afternoon, under the warmth of the sun, James, Sarah, and Megan relaxed in the backyard, basking in the heat. Sarah lay stretched out on a lounge chair, flipping through a magazine, while James sat nearby, pretending to focus on the book in his hands. Megan, meanwhile, was applying sunscreen to her shoulders, her slow, deliberate movements drawing his gaze, which he found himself sneaking over the top of his book. The conversation drifted slowly, everyone seeming wrapped in their own thoughts. Then, Megan, in a tone that felt both casual and slightly provocative, broke the silence. "Sarah, do you mind if I take off my bikini top? I just can't stand tan lines." Sarah looked up from her magazine and gave an easy smile. "Go right ahead. Don't worry about it." James's pulse quickened despite himself. Megan turned to him, meeting his gaze with an intensity that made him hesitate. "Is that all right with you, James?" she asked, a playful smile flickering on her lips. He swallowed hard, feeling caught off guard. He hadn't expected her to ask him. Trying to keep his composure, he stammered slightly. What?" Megan tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady and almost hypnotic. "Would you mind if I took my top off?" she repeated, her words carrying an unmistakable undertone. James hesitated briefly but then forced a shrug, trying to appear casual. "No, sure, that's fine," he replied, his voice barely steady. Megan smiled, satisfied, and without looking away from him, slowly untied her bikini top, letting it slip beside her on the lounge chair. James quickly looked away, though he couldn't stop the rush of desire rising in his chest, a pull that made him want to relive the vision from the night before. He fought against the urge to look back, his face flushed with a mixture of excitement and guilt. As Megan lay face down to soak up the sun, Sarah continued reading her magazine, as if nothing unusual had happened. James forced himself to look back at his book, but the words seemed to blur on the page as his mind spun with images and scenarios he knew he should resist. The afternoon passed slowly, the air thick with a tension that only he seemed to feel. Later, as evening settled in and Sarah went upstairs to take a shower, James followed her to the bedroom. Dinner was still a little while away, but he needed to confront the feelings that had been simmering inside him. "Sarah," he started cautiously as she stood in front of the mirror, brushing her damp hair. "I've been wondering, why did things end between you and Megan?" Sarah paused, clearly taken aback by the question. She turned to him, her gaze open but tinged with a hint of nostalgia. "I already told you, it was just a phase. No, I mean the real reason. What was it that really made you two go separate ways?" he pressed, as though her answer might somehow untangle the turmoil in his mind. Sarah sighed, lowering herself onto the bed. She stared at the floor for a moment, as though piecing her thoughts together. "Megan's an incredible person. Intelligent, fun, always up for something new. I loved being with her," she began, her gaze drifting. "But there was something. She's insatiable, James, almost addicted to intimacy. I couldn't keep up. At first I thought I could, but she always wanted more, always something different. It became too much. I realized I needed a relationship that felt balanced. Megan, she needs someone who can keep up with her speed." A chill ran down James's spine. Instead of quelling the desire that had been building, Sarah's words seemed to fuel it, sparking the forbidden temptation all over again. It was as if she were describing an irresistible, almost dangerous allure, a temptation he was trying and failing to resist. He sat beside her, his thoughts spiraling. The idea of a menage resurfaced, stronger than ever. The thought of Megan, her teasing looks, and now Sarah's description of her unrestrained passion. It felt like a part of him, the most primal part, was about to burst. But deep down, He knew that letting this desire take over could shatter everything he and Sarah had built. James took a long, steadying breath, fighting back the urge to share with Sarah the absurd idea that had lodged itself in his mind. He watched her for a moment, feeling the weight of unspoken words and the realization that one wrong step could change their lives forever. Later, when James went downstairs for dinner, his heart hammered as he entered the kitchen. There was Megan, leaning against the counter, casually scrolling through her phone. She was wearing a fitted dress that highlighted every curve, and her gaze sharpened as she looked up at him, making him pause. Megan raised her eyes, her lips curving into a smile that held a trace of provocation. "So, James?" she said, her voice low and sultry. He blinked, startled, feeling his face heat. What proposal?" he managed, trying to sound surprised. But his voice came out shaky, almost pleading for her not to say more. Megan took a step closer, closing the distance between them until she was mere inches away, her eyes glinting with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. "The proposal you've been thinking about since you first saw me here," she murmured, her tone both daring and seductive. "Ask Sarah. If she's on board, I am." James felt paralyzed, a wave of heat and shame flooding over him. Her words echoed through his mind like a siren's call, tempting and impossible to ignore. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. It was as though the air had vanished from the room, and all he could do was stare at her, his heart thudding in his chest. I'll go grab more wine," he stammered, desperate to escape the moment. "We're running low." Megan stepped back, that mysterious smile still dancing on her lips. "Go on, James, get the wine," she said, her voice thick with suggestion. "Who knows? Maybe things will just happen naturally." James felt his knees weaken as he headed upstairs to where Sarah was. In the bathroom, he caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror, his face flushed, his breathing uneven. What was happening to him? Megan's direct challenge had thrown him completely off balance, leaving him suspended between guilt and longing. He realized that bringing the wine might open doors that were better left closed, but he couldn't shake the pull to let things take their own uncertain path. "I'm just going to grab some wine. I'll be right back," he told Sarah, forcing a casual tone. She just smiled, preoccupied with choosing an outfit for dinner. James left the house, his heart still pounding as he drove to the nearest store. Walking through the aisles, his mind spun with Megan's words, questioning if he truly had the nerve to go through with something so reckless. Then, as he turned down a row, he spotted an older man studying bottles of wine. The man's shoulders were slightly stooped, and his hair was a graying silver. Pang hit James's chest. The man looked so much like his late father that, for a moment, he completely forgot why he was there. He stood frozen, watching as the man carefully selected a bottle, just as his father had always done. A flood of memories washed over him, and his father's words came to him as clearly as if he'd just spoken them. "If evil tempts you, kneel, pray, and ask for strength. God will step in and save you." In that instant, James felt as if the weight of the world had dropped onto him. His hands shook, and he blinked back tears. "What was I thinking?" he whispered, horrified by his own desire, by how close he'd come to risking everything he had with Sarah for a dangerous whim. He put the bottle of wine back on the shelf and left the store in a near sprint, his heart racing. Once in his car, he leaned his head against the steering wheel. He began to pray, asking for the very thing his father had always urged, strength and protection against temptation. The words came out in a soft murmur, a confession, and with each one, he felt a sense of relief lifting the weight of the past weeks. He pleaded to be saved from himself. When he finally felt calmer, he started the car and headed back home. Pulling into the driveway, he closed his eyes for a moment, grateful that his father's words had reached him in time. Though the temptation still lingered, he felt a new resolve to hold firm and not let it ruin his life. Inside, he found Sarah alone in the kitchen, washing dishes. She turned around, looking surprised. "Can you believe it? Megan's work called," she said, drying her hands. "They needed her to go back home immediately because of an emergency." James froze, feeling a shock like a punch to the gut. He blinked, taking in her words. Megan was gone, just like that. She told me to send you a kiss and said thanks for everything, Sarah added, smiling. I don't think we'll be seeing her again anytime soon. Relief flooded through James, so strong that he had to lean against the counter. His father's words echoed once more, and he gave silent thanks right there. It was as if, somehow, his prayer had been heard, pulling him back from the edge of the cliff he had nearly stepped over. Sarah watched him with a curious smile but didn't say anything. James just smiled back, a genuine smile, and wrapped her in a hug. His heart was still racing, but now it was from gratitude and a profound sense of relief. The temptation had passed, and he knew, without a doubt, that he wouldn't be looking back. Leave a comment below to share your thoughts on James's actions. If you were in his shoes, would you have considered the proposal?